I'll be reading from Exodus 15, 1-2, and 11-13. Then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to the Lord. I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and its rider he has hurled into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation. He is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will exalt him. Who among the gods is like you, O Lord? Who is like you? Majestic in holiness, awesome in glory, working wonders. You stretched out your right hand, and the earth swallowed them. In your unfailing love, you will lead the people you have redeemed. In your strength, you will guide them to your holy dwelling.
As I've repeated a few times during the pandemic, 16 months ago, well, more now actually, it felt a little like we entered a cave that we couldn't see the end of, like we got lost in a maze, right? Like we entered a dark forest not knowing where the path was leading. Like, as we talked about most, we were on a foggy bridge with no idea what lay on the other side. These have all been images I've sensed that have helped us to understand what we've been going through. Yet, one thing we haven't done is compare what we've been experiencing to God's people crossing the Red Sea. But you know, if you think about it, that works too. Imminent danger has propelled us forward onto a previously unimaginable path. A way forward that has felt desperately insecure, and yet we have taken step after step in faith. All the while also naturally asking many questions about what life will be like when we get to the other side. The crossing of the Red Sea is most certainly another example, a big old biblical example of what fancy people call a liminal experience. A time when something very significant changes in our lives or the world, and so we're thrust into a transition. We have no guarantees about what life is going to be like on the other side. At times like these, something akin to Pharaoh's army has forced us to contemplate a terrifying and unbelievable journey. At times like these, God offers us a new way forward. But it's a way forward we would previously have thought unimaginable. And we, for a moment, look out at that terrifying, unimaginable path before us and we ask, how can we even do this? How can we even do this? Do you remember some of the ways in which we asked that question this past year and a half? Do you remember when we asked, how in the world can we teach everyone in this congregation to use Zoom when some of us don't even know how to use our email? Do you remember when we asked, how in the world will we support one another through the hardest thing that some of us have seen in our lifetimes when we can't even be together? Do you remember when we asked, how in the world will we build a future together when COVID seems to be tearing down things that we spent decades building up? As the danger of the pandemic pressed us against the sea, even as the water began to part and a way forward began to appear, we still asked, how can we even do this? Now, you might remember that the last couple of times I reminded us of comparisons like these, the foggy bridge comparison, for example, I talked about how we were beginning to be able to see the end. The first time, many months ago, I was pretty cautious about it. I think I said we were just beginning to make out the general shape of things. The second time, just a few months ago, I got more bold. I suggested that we were close enough to the end that we could probably make out many of the details now. And then yet, here we all still are in a fourth wave. Having just canceled a church picnic, postponed the beginning of Sunday school, sending our kids to school, but with the COVID numbers actually higher than they were when we kept them home last year. reading headlines like, "The COVID endgame, is the pandemic over already? Or are there years to go?" Or the much blunter headline, "Is it ever going to end?" Certainly, some things have changed. Most of us are vaccinated. Many of us are here in person. But does it, in many ways, also feel like that other side of the bridge that we thought we could see might also have been a mirage? Like we're actually just back in the fog? Like we're suddenly asking new versions of that same question we asked when we stepped onto that bridge in the first place. Specifically, the question, how can we even do this? You might not have spoken it exactly like that this week or this month, but your spirit's asking that question if you've ever wondered what it will mean for us if we end up having to all go back to worshiping online. Your spirit's asking it if you've ever wondered how long we can continue to go without Sunday school. Your spirit is asking it if you've begun to wonder if we can handle potentially having to postpone that renewal conversation again. Your spirit is asking it if you look at the fall or even full school year ahead and your heart screams, I kid you not, if we have to go through all of this again, I can't even. If your spirit is feeling any or even all of this or some version of this, I'm with you. I'm there too. For goodness sake, Shanda and I just allowed ourselves to send Ollie back to school this fall and then fell in love with Ollie falling in love with school, only to have to keep him home for the next 2 days with a cough, which thankfully I didn't note earlier, he has tested negative for COVID, a PCR test. But it's at times like these that I can only sigh with you, but then also circle back to God's story one more time. And then ask God yet again, do you still have anything left in here for me? And you know what? This summer, as I did that, I once more remembered our image of the foggy bridge. And then thanks to our conference minister, Catherine Jameson Pitts, I recognized that that image is not so different from the story of God's people crossing the Red Sea. And that through it, God's story might, just might, have yet something more to give us, even in all of this all over again. Something to give those of us who are tired of making hard decisions about COVID safety in our personal lives and in our church family. Something to give those of us who are sending our precious children back to school on what feels like little more than a wing and a prayer. Something to give those of us who are exhausted. Something to give those of us who are done with this. Something to give those of us who are pissed off. And who are nevertheless still looking at the year ahead and saying, dear God, is this really still not over? Something to give those of us who are asking, if this is going to continue, what could possibly move us forward anymore? Because if you're feeling anything like me, that's the question, right? When the future continues to be terrifyingly impossible to know, and we are starting to feel paralyzed by exhaustion, what moves us forward? Well, here's that thing from God's story that I'm talking about. When God's people got to the Red Sea with Pharaoh's army breathing down their necks and stared out at an entire sea ahead of them, surely they too were asking, what moves us forward? Stuck between a murderous army and a drowning, they had to be wondering, how in the world could we possibly move forward again? But then, somehow, they saw the signs of the previously unimaginable happening before their very eyes. And yet still, they must have looked at those parted waters, also terrifying in their own right, and asked, how in the world can we possibly move forward in this? And yet, as we know, they did. And on the other side of the Red Sea, after having taken their first step, and then another, in faith, across a previously unimaginable path, through a terrifying tunnel, walls of water ready to crash down on both sides. The other end of all of that, God's people stopped and they sang. and they sang this song. I will sing to God, for God has triumphed gloriously. God is my strength and my might. God is my salvation. In your steadfast love, you lead the people whom you redeemed. In your steadfast love, you lead the people whom you redeemed. So what led God's people when they faced a terrifying future? What led God's people when even the path that began to appear looked too terrifying to contemplate? What led them forward? Love led them forward. It's right there in God's story as we have it in Scripture, and you know what? It's been right there in the midst of the rest of God's story, even the part that we've been living out. When we stood at the edge of that previously unimaginable path and had to do what might have seemed impossible, what moved us forward? Love moved us forward. Love that moved us to care for one another's health and safety, even when we had to do it in ways we weren't sure would work. Love that moved us to care for our neighbor's safety, even when it seemed like they may no longer care about ours. Love that moved us to hear and respond to the cries for justice that rose up along the way from the streets of Minneapolis and beyond, even when it threatened our privilege at a time that we should have wanted to just cash it in. Love moved us forward. And so now, as we stare at what's ahead, asking how in the world can we move forward, God's story is here to remind us that we can truly move forward because, like God's people recognized when they sang on the other side of the Red Sea, love moves us forward. And because it was love that moved us forward, we can, even in our tiredness right now, pause to recognize that when we continue to reach deep down inside ourselves one more time and act yet again with love, a whole choir swells up around us to join the chorus, to lift us up, to inspire us, to keep us moving forward. Because when we act with love, including when it's hard, especially when it's hard, we sing with the entire choir of God's people from all of history who let love move them forward. We sing with God's people on the other side of the Red Sea. We sing with God's people as they sprint home from an empty tomb. We sing with God's people as they survive a brutal persecution through the 16th century. We sing with God's people who crossed the bridge at Selma. We sing with God's people who, when the law finally saw fit to give justice to George Floyd's family and every family he represented that day, shouted with joy. We join together with all of God's people, past and present, including those who took the hard road through this pandemic, making difficult choices and previously unimaginable sacrifices out of love for our neighbors and in faith that God can do miracles. And we sing. We sing that it is God, that it is love that brings us home. You know, when they reached the other side of that Red Sea, God's people recognized that love was leading them home. They were also far from home free. For goodness sakes, they had 40 more years of wandering in the desert before they'd actually get home. And so, as much as I hope this isn't 40 years of this, like God's people on the other side of that Red Sea, and also like God's people sprinting home from that empty tomb, and also like God's people in the 16th century, and also like God's people in Selma, and also like God's people who heard the first news on the streets of Minneapolis, love is bringing us home. But at the same time, we're not home free yet. But it's still, at moments like these, it's on the other side of Red Seas, it's at important junctures along the way when we have successfully made it through the hardships thus far. Even when there are more to come, it's at times like these that we can be reminded, that we have to be reminded of what, when it really, really counts, of what moves us forward, what brings us home eventually, what we must continue to allow to take us there. And so, as you worship this morning, as you ask yourself, what's next? As we start another church year full of possibilities, but also possible postponements, As you go back to your school and your jobs and your strained relationships and your emotionally maxed out homes and another fall in a pandemic that seems to just keep raging, may you have the strength and the courage. May God give you the grace and the blessing to join the song of God's people, to join the song that echoes up from the ages, to join the only song that keeps singing into eternity, to join the song that sings, "It is love that has brought us this far, and it is love that will always bring us home."